Hello everyone, this is an updated tutorial and kind of a status update for Umbra Boundary Builder 2.0. There are a few things that have changed, a few quality of life improvements, as well as quite a few efficiency improvements in the back end, and one major bug fix for a bug that was causing a lot of editor overhead. So I'm going to jump into this tutorial, and for any experienced users, you should pick up on the few little things that have changed and the nice features that are in here now. And I definitely recommend upgrading to 2.0 if you get the chance. Again, because of the efficiency improvements and that one big bug fix, especially. So without further ado, let's get into it. So you go to Game Object, Umbra Evolution, Umbra Boundary Builder, Add Boundary Builder, and that'll place a boundary builder in the scene. And this boundary builder is meant to manage all of your boundaries. If you try to add a second one, you're going to get some errors in the console and it's not going to create one for you. There are obviously ways around that, but again, you'll throw errors and it'll tell you, please don't do that. This boundary builder is where you're going to manage all of the boundaries in a scene. You can give them meaningful names for areas within your levels that people will be able to read and understand. And you can color coordinate them for whatever purposes you have, or just to make them stand out from some other gizmos you might have in a scene. You can also delete them from here. That'll remove them from the hierarchy, and you can go to them directly without having to click on them in the hierarchy. Once you're looking at a boundary, something new here is a placeable layers field, and it's just a layer mask that corresponds to your physics layers, and this is going to adjust how the raycast works to place nodes, because a few users reported that they were having floating nodes, and the common cause of this was a trigger somewhere in the scene that was catching raycasts, and then that would end up with nodes being placed on top of it. So if I do this, you'll notice that the nodes are placed all around this this trigger here, and then obviously that's not useful at all. So I'll just delete these nodes and change this layer mask just to default, which is what I have my terrain on. And on the blocker cube, I've just put on another layer for now. So now if I try to place nodes, they're going to end up where they're supposed to be on the terrain. So you can use this to ignore details or other little things that you don't want the boundary to respect, so that you can get right down to the terrain underneath it and make sure that these boundaries are tight against that terrain, or wherever you want the node to be placed, really. Next thing is just a setting to change the gizmo color that corresponds to this field here, and then another one to change the node color for all these little nodes that you can also interact with individually, and we'll get into that in a little bit. The next setting just adds a connection between the last node and the first node, and that just seals everything off nicely. Or you could always just place another connection there, and that would have basically the same effect. You can toggle box colliders on and off. Obviously, we want to use box colliders instead of mesh colliders. That's one of the reasons I created this package, because any of the tools that allow you to create a poly shape and then apply a mesh collider to it are typically fairly inefficient ways to box players into your level. But you can toggle these off if you're using this mainly for nav mesh generation, but you don't actually want your player to hit any colliders that be blocked by this. You can change the thickness, typically to prevent a player from escaping, or to create larger gaps between sections of nav mesh so they don't generate any links or anything. You can adjust the height, again, primarily to keep the player in if they have some pretty extreme ways to get out, or if you have some sort of large aerial area you're trying to keep the player inside. There's a vertical offset. You can lift the entire boundary off the ground or sink it into the ground a little ways to prevent any gaps along the edge of the boundary. So if we stop placing nodes, I'll show you a few things here that we can do with them. We can move them. We can tweak them individually. You'll notice that when I move the node up, the boundary doesn't adjust, and that's because in this version of Umbra Boundary Builder, the base of each boundary section is aligned with whichever node of its two nodes that make up that section. Whichever node is lowest is the node that the base will be aligned with. And this is just to make things a little bit easier, as I'll show you when I try to build a boundary over this large piece of terrain here. So we can move those nodes around. And another thing that's new is that the links are generated based on position within the hierarchy. So if I take this node and I change its position in the hierarchy, these nodes are going to connect from 2 to 5 and 5 to 3 instead of the way they were before. So it's just a nice little change, so you don't have to fiddle with as many things to be able to adjust your boundaries and tweak them to get exactly the setting you're looking for. Last thing we're going to do here is we're going to generate a mesh, and this mesh is what you're going to use to generate your nav mesh if you want AI to respect these boundaries as well. Something you can do after you generate that nav mesh is disable the mesh renderer or remove the mesh renderer entirely. I typically don't recommend that because I, for one, I'm always forgetting to re-enable them. And then when I generate my nav mesh the next time, because of changes that have been made elsewhere, I have all these nice passable areas in my nav mesh that were supposed to be blocked off. So what I've done instead is I've created this material that's perfectly invisible and doesn't interact with light in any way. So you can just leave this on, and it should be appropriate. Maybe before your final builds or your big demo builds, you could go and disable the mesh renderers or remove them entirely from these boundaries, and then do your builds if you're so inclined. You'll also notice that these static flags have been set so that the navigation, the nav mesh generation will work properly, and this just happens automatically. You can also mess with these if you're so inclined, or have any other settings you want to do, but you'll have to go into the scripts and just change in boundary builder editor.cs. You'll have to change the static flags that are being set from within there. So now if I want to create a boundary over this mountain, I can just start placing nodes, and I'm going to want to turn off this closed loop for this example. And you'll notice that if my nodes are far apart, these sections of boundary have quite a few gaps in them. But if I make them close together, that's not going to be as much of a problem. Now you can have large spaces between these nodes, and then all you have to do is increase the height until those gaps are sealed. And then you can even decrease the vertical offset to just suck that boundary down into the terrain and get the shape you're looking for. And to go into a little bit more detail about why we line things up like this, typically if you try to realign these pieces of boundary so that they're more parallel between the two nodes, you get some strange angles and a lot of weak spots which players can exploit to escape levels. And the change from the previous version, where this baseline is aligned with the lowest node instead of between the two, is just so that typically now you can increase the height and you don't have to do much with this vertical offset. Whereas before, every piece of terrain required very different settings for these two values to get basically the same result that you see here. Now it's just a little more consistent, and it's kind of all up to this height with very little vertical offset required for each boundary. Basically, this is just a tool to make things really easy for anyone who might be working on your project to be able to go in there and get boundaries set up so that they can keep your players in the level. You don't have to fiddle with them or rebake them all the time or edit them all the time or go and fix them. by hand all the time. Hopefully the solution makes things quite a bit easier for you and helps make everything a lot more efficient than some of the other solutions that are out there. As always, if you have any questions, just use my email or go to the website. The link will be around here somewhere, and then use the contact form on that website. And please, if you're using that contact form, make sure that your email address actually accepts external emails and isn't just restricted to internal company emails, and that it's a valid email address, that you don't mistype it into the contact form, because I've had a few support emails recently that I can't respond to for those very reasons. And please don't try to leave any comments on this YouTube video or on the asset store itself for support purposes, because it's very likely that I won't see them. So by all means, if you bought this product and you like it, leave a review. But for support, just go in through the website. So I hope you're having a good morning, afternoon, caffeine fueled evening of work, and have a good one.